Infinite scrolling React table. If you are looking for a tutorial on this topic, you came to the right place. In this video, I'll show you how to implement infinite scrolling by lazily loading data as the user scrolls and making sure that React doesn't add hundreds of elements to the DOM as you scroll down. Don't worry, this isn't as hard as it sounds. Whether you're working with an existing table or starting from scratch, this video will give you all the tools you need to get started with infinite scrolling in React. I will be starting with an existing table. It is extremely simple. It is a scrollable table that has a sticky header. I am using Shadcn UI along with TanStack table for table state management. Here's a quick overview of where I'll be starting from. All project files will be contained inside this table folder. I have here the fake data file, which defines the structure of the fake user data. Two notable functions here is the makeData function, which generates a number of users, and the fetchData function, which we will be using later for simulating async retrieval of user data from a database. We then have the TanStack table column definitions, which just defines the columns that exists in this table. And finally, the data table component. One quick note, if you are using Shadcn UI table and are having issues with header not being sticky at the top when scrolling, all you have to do is remove the div that surrounds the table component. That will fix the issue. If you need further explanation on how I created this table, I've already made a tutorial on it. The link will be down in the description. Same with the starter project. However, if you want the finished project, continue watching as I'll be displaying the link later in the video. Let's begin by making sure you have TanStack query installed. We'll be using this package to help manage our infinite fetch query. It really does simplify managing the lazily fetch data, so I highly recommend using it. We'll need to create a query client at the root of our React project and wrap everything inside a query client provider. If you miss this, no TanStack query hook will work inside your project. Back in the data table component, remove the row data state and we'll replace this with use infinite query from TanStack. This hook returns multiple useful objects and functions. The naming of these are pretty self-explanatory. The first argument is the query key. This can be a string or nested objects or even arguments that needs to be passed into the query function. It is used to uniquely identify and cache the query. The query function is where you define what you want the query to do. Here we just make a call to fetch data and return it. Note that you can throw errors in this function and TanStack will return an error object that can be used as well. Get next param is required, and in this case, it just needs to return a number that will help the query function know the start offset. Refetch on window focus and placeholder data is optional, but I like to set them as is, so query does not run so aggressively. Because data is an object that contains an array of row data, meaning it is a two-dimensional array, we'll need to flatten it so it becomes a single one-dimensional array that we can loop through to render each row. If we try printing out data, you can clearly see this. Opening the object, we have pages, which is an array, and then opening up the first element of pages is also an array containing row data. To show how many rows we have fetched, I'll add two variables here, total DB row count and total fetched. Total row count number is defined in fake data and is returned on every query. Now we will define what happens when the user scrolls to the bottom of the table. For this, we'll create a fetch more on bottom reached function. Make sure to use the use callback hook here, or else this function will be recreated on every single render. And let me tell you, this component does re-render a lot because as we scroll, it will re-render the whole component. We will be using this function with the div container responsible for scrolling. Inside here, we simply calculate whether the scroll is within 500 pixels of the bottom of the table. Make sure that we are currently not fetching new data and that total fetch is still less than the total amount of rows available. Don't forget to add dependencies that this function uses. Define a useEffect hook that calls the above function whenever the dependency changes. This is to check if the table has already scrolled to the bottom, and if so, immediately fetch more data. Let's define the table container ref, which will be the reference to the div that is in charge of scrolling. I'll quickly add a rows variable here as we need it later. In the scrolling div container, assign onScroll to fetch more on bottom reached and set the ref to the table container ref. Now whenever we scroll, the function will evaluate whether to fetch more data or not. Running the project, you can see that infinite scrolling is now working, but oh my gosh, table elements just going to continue being added to the DOM. Is that what you're thinking? Well, this is probably going to start affecting performance very quickly. That's a legit concern, so let's go ahead and tackle some performance optimization now. We'll be using TanStack Virtual to virtualize our DOM row nodes. So only the visible rows are being added to the DOM, plus a little extra to ensure smooth scrolling. Use the useVirtualizer hook, specify the count, which is the amount of rows inside the table. Estimated size is needed for accurate scroll bar scrolling. GetScrollElement should return the scrollable container ref. MeasureElements is called whenever virtualizer needs to dynamically measure the row height. Overscan is the number of rows above and below the visible viewport that should be added to the DOM to ensure smooth scrolling. The higher the number, the more elements inside the viewport that will be rendered, which could potentially impact performance. One thing I forgot is taking care of when the query is still loading initially. Let's go ahead and display a little loading text. To implement the row virtualizer, all we need to do is replace the row.getRowModel with row virtualizer and set the row variable to the table rows with the virtual row index. If we run the project now, you'll immediately notice something weird is happening. The table row is flickering continuously due to virtualization. Let's go ahead and add data index, ref, and style to the table row and see if this fixes the issue. Still not working. Also, I've made a mistake earlier. Fetch more on bottom reached call should be inside the useEffect hook. If you haven't already caught that, then go ahead and fix that now. In the table body, let's replace the table getTotalSize with row virtualizer. Okay, at least this fixes the sticky header. Let's try one more thing by adding absolute positioning for our table row. Great, that works like a charm. If we take a look at the dev tools, you can clearly see that only the visible and the overscanned rows are being rendered onto the DOM. It changes as we scroll and no more elements are being added. If you would like the code for this finished project, here is the link. Please let me know if this tutorial helped, or if you have any questions, leave them down below in the comments. Smash the like and subscribe button if you enjoyed it. Otherwise, thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one.